Chris Pine's Captain Kirk held an impressive record, then Star Trek Into Darkness immediately broke it. Star Trek Into Darkness immediately broke an impressive Starfleet record held by Captain James T. Kirk Chris Pine. Star Trek Into Darkness was the follow-up to director J.J. Abrams' Star Trek 2009 reboot that recast the characters from Star Trek, the original series, and set the young Starfleet heroes in an alternate timeline. Chris Pine's Kirk lived a different life than William Shatner's Kirk, and he became captain of the Enterprise years before Shatner's Kirk did in Star Trek's prime timeline. Star Trek 2009 ended with James T. Kirk and Commander Spock Zachary Quinto leading the Starship Enterprise to defeat Nero Eric Bana, a genocidal Romulan who came from the 24th century. For his exemplary heroism, Kirk was promoted to captain and given command of the USS Enterprise, relieving its injured former commander, Captain Christopher Pike Bruce Greenwood. Kirk launched the Enterprise on a new mission to explore strange new worlds, and Star Trek Into Darkness picks up the story 1 year later, in 2259. Kirk didn't lose any Starship Enterprise crew until Star Trek Into Darkness. Star Trek Into Darkness began with Captain Kirk leading a mission to Nibiru, where the Starship Enterprise prevented a volcanic eruption that would destroy the planet. Kirk's gambit nearly killed Spock, and the Enterprise violated Star Trek's prime directive by exposing the starship to the primitive people of Nibiru. At Starfleet Command, Admiral Pike tore into Kirk, admonishing him for nearly getting his crew killed. Kirk replied, "Except I didn't. You know how many crew members I've lost? Not one. Not one." Taking Captain Kirk at his word, and Jim's boast could have easily been disproven, then Kirk had an exemplary record during his first year as captain of the Enterprise. Kirk didn't even lose any red shirts between Star Trek 2009 and Star Trek Into Darkness. Tragically, Star Trek Into Darkness quickly blemished Kirk's spotless record. Numerous Enterprise crew members died in the film, some horrifically flung into space while the starship was in mid-warp and pursued by Admiral Alexander Marcus's Peter Weller USS Vengeance. Among the body count of Star Trek Into Darkness was Captain James T. Kirk himself. Kirk sacrificed his life by physically reactivating the Starship Enterprise's warp core, and he quickly succumbed to radiation poisoning. However, unlike the personnel he lost, Kirk was quickly resurrected. After Spock and LT Nyota Uhura Zoe Saldana captured Khan Noonien Singh Benedict Cumberbatch, Dr. Leonard McCoy Carl Urban used Khan's genetically engineered superblood to bring Kirk back to life. For one shining year before Star Trek Into Darkness began, Captain Kirk kept his entire Enterprise crew alive. Star Trek Into Darkness marked the only time in a Star Trek movie that Captain Kirk died while commanding the USS Enterprise, and was brought back to life. In contrast, William Shatner's Captain Kirk died in Star Trek Generations, and he was never resurrected. In Star Trek Beyond, Captain Kirk lost more crew members to Krall Idris Elba and his swarm on Ultimate, and the Starship Enterprise was also destroyed. But for one shining year before Star Trek Into Darkness began, Captain Kirk kept his entire Enterprise crew alive. For a brief, shining moment in sci-fi cinema, Chris Pine's version of Captain James T. Kirk held one of the most fascinating and quietly impressive records in the Star Trek franchise. It was a record not based on sheer strength or ship count, nor was it about the number of Klingons defeated or tribbles petted. No, Pine's Kirk had something far rarer, an uninterrupted arc of leadership that honored both legacy and reinvention. And then, just as he started to fly, Star Trek Into Darkness brought him crashing down to Earth, literally and narratively. When J.J. Abrams rebooted the Star Trek universe in 2009 with the aptly titled Star Trek, fans were wary. Recasting iconic roles is like rewriting scripture. Everyone has an opinion, and most are skeptical. But then Chris Pine swaggered onto the screen, bringing with him a youthful, reckless charm that somehow mirrored William Shatner's charisma while carving out a new identity. He wasn't just Captain Kirk, he was a Captain Kirk. One molded by tragedy, defiance, and a destiny written in the stars. What made his debut so striking was not merely the energy Pine brought, but the narrative position he occupied. Unlike Shatner's Kirk, who gradually climbed the ranks through the traditional Starfleet ladder, Pine's Kirk was fast-tracked, catapulted into the captain's chair of the Enterprise by the cataclysmic destruction of Vulcan, and a wild combination of courage, instinct, and necessity. He became the youngest captain in Starfleet history. That alone was a record worth noting. But that wasn't the only impressive feat. Pine's Kirk in Star Trek 2009 was one of the few incarnations of the character to take the captain's chair and keep it for an entire film without a major demotion, breakdown, or mutiny. He earned it, held it, and made it work. His journey was far from traditional, but it signaled a shift in how Star Trek could tell its stories, more emotionally driven, action-packed, yet still reverent to the weight of command. That record, though, of ascending and holding command with grit and flair was short-lived. Star Trek Into Darkness, released in 2013, wasted no time in doing what many sequels do: break the toy it was handed. Within the first few scenes, Kirk is relieved of command. It was a narratively rich decision, sure, but also a frustrating one. Here was a character who had just spent an entire film proving himself, only to be knocked back to square one before the second adventure had even started. And what did he lose command for? Saving a planet, albeit by bending the Prime Directive. It was a very Kirk move. But in this universe, one defined by a darker tone and a more politically entangled Starfleet, that rule-breaking had consequences. Pine's Kirk, unlike his original counterpart, was still finding the line between boldness and recklessness. And Starfleet, particularly Admiral Pike, made an example of him. It was a move that shifted the tone of the franchise. No longer was this a heroic rise. It was now a tale of humility, bureaucracy, and moral gray areas. The invincible young captain was made mortal, not by enemy phasers, but by political pressure and leadership consequences. For Pine's Kirk, it was a kind of crucifixion before any resurrection. While Shatner's Kirk in The Wrath of Khan grappled with aging, Pine's Kirk in Into Darkness was already wrestling with legacy, worthiness, and death at just the beginning of his command. This arc was not a failure by any means. In fact, narratively, it deepened the character. Stripping Kirk of his rank forced him to reckon with what it truly meant to lead. And when Admiral Pike, his mentor and father figure, was killed, the burden of command returned, heavier than ever. The loss of his record as the youngest unbroken commander paled in comparison to the emotional crucible he now faced. But still, that record, brief as it was, said something profound about Star Trek's evolving identity. In the 2009 film, the franchise embraced the optimism of youth, the thrill of bold decisions, and the romanticism of space exploration. Pine's uninterrupted tenure as captain reflected that mood, fast, bright, and brash. Then Into Darkness pulled the rug out. Suddenly, leadership was complicated. The chain of command was a weight, not a prize. The galaxy was murkier. Heroes were not invincible. The record was gone, but in its breaking, a more mature and nuanced Star Trek was born. It's a reflection of the real world, too. In life, we rarely get to keep our trophies untouched. Records are set only to be broken. Positions of power often come with consequences, revisions, and self-doubt. The glory of the captain's chair is temporary. The responsibilities are forever. Chris Pine's portrayal of Kirk remains one of the franchise's greatest reinventions. He gave us a version of the character who could wear the arrogance of youth and the weight of leadership in equal measure. His brief, shining record as the youngest, unchallenged Enterprise captain was more than trivia, it was a statement of potential. And its quick undoing Into Darkness was not a narrative betrayal, but a call to grow. In the end, the broken record became a badge of honor. Pine's Kirk didn't need an unbroken command to define him. He